Okay. Good afternoon. I'm Ken Jarin, Chair of the International Broadcasting Advisory Board, or IBAB. I'm thrilled to welcome you to the IBAB's first public event, Advancing Freedom of Information, Strategies and Solutions for Addressing the PRC's Malign Influence. First, I want to introduce to you my fellow board members. To my right is Kathleen, who will moderate the program in a little while. To my immediate left is Jamie Fly. To Jamie's left is Luis Botello. And our fifth board member, who's not with us today, is Michelle Gaida. Today's conversation cannot be more urgent. As we speak, the People's Republic of China and other authoritarian adversaries like Russia and Iran are making heavy investments to control the flow of information inside their own countries and rapidly expand malign influence abroad. Top experts will join us today and join you today in examining not only the malign influence, disinformation, and propaganda seeded by the PRC, but perhaps even more important, the solutions that the US AGM and its entities are currently using to overcome digital censorship and advance the free flow of information. Now, you may be asking yourself, what is IBAB and how does it relate to US AGM? Before we begin this important conversation, I'll share a quick overview of who we are and what we do. We are an independent federal entity confirmed by the United States Senate, composed of experts in journalism, public policy, and foreign policy, who provide strategic counsel and oversight in partnership with the U.S. Agency for Global Media, CEO Amanda Bennett. We're thrilled to have the opportunity to work with Amanda on a regular basis on all that she and the US AGM does. Together, our board members bring a wealth of experience in journalism, government, and public policy, leadership, talent, and passion to bear on our vital mission. The IBAB ensures editorial independence and enhances the impact of the work carried out by the US AGM's news networks and entities, many of whom you'll hear from today. Over 420 million people in more than 100 countries turn to our networks and entities every day for news and information in 64 languages around the globe. Our journalists and staff make considerable sacrifices and work on the front lines of freedom, often in very dangerous circumstances. They defend and advance American interests and values. And we on the IBAB have the privilege of supporting them in this vital mission to inform, engage, and connect people around the world in support of freedom and democracy. It's now my pleasure to turn over the program to my fellow board member and our moderator, Kathleen.
Thank you, Ken. As a broadcast news journalist here in our U.S. Capitol, Washington, D.C., for more than 30 years, I'm really proud to be your moderator today and honored to be part of the International Broadcasting Advisory Board's really important work supporting the U.S. Agency for Global Media's mission. I think on behalf of all my fellow IBAB members, I can say that we truly believe that the work of US AGM and its entities is more important than ever, especially as we see the rising threats to press freedom from authoritarian regimes around the world, including the People's Republic of China, but also Russia and Iran. So thank you if you're joining us live via YouTube on this for this important program. And if you have a chance and are joining us later through the ibab.gov website, we welcome you to this broadcast. We also hope that you will continue to join us in the future for what we hope will be just the first of many of these important broadcasts and forums. You're going to hear today from the leadership representing all of the U.S. Agency for Global Media entities. That includes, of course, the Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Office of Cuba Broadcasting, Radio Free Asia, Middle East Broadcasting Networks, and of course, the Open Technology Fund. I think the speakers you hear are going to be highlighting how the U.S. AGM entities represent some of the only credible sources of news and information for audiences inside of China and for the Chinese diaspora communities around the world, and also people everywhere in the world that are being flooded by propaganda from the People's Republic of China. During the second part of the broadcast, after you hear from all of our US AGM entities, you're going to hear from two prominent outside experts who will outline the authoritarian challenge that's presented by the PRC, and also have some suggestions on methods that are most effective in combating its malign influence. We want this to be an informative but also solutions-based conversation. We've asked the speakers to be succinct, under 5 minutes for each one of them, so that we have time for your questions and also questions from my fellow IBAB members at the end of the conversation. So first up, we're going to hear from the Open Technology Fund. OTF addresses or advances internet freedom worldwide. It enables audiences to access and share independent news and empowers our journalists to do their jobs in the face of repressive censorship and surveillance. So I'm happy to be able to turn the broadcast over now to Nat Gretchen, who's the Senior Vice President for Programs at OTF, who's going to tell us more about their important work.
Thanks so much, Kathleen. Really appreciate it. For those of you who aren't as familiar with OTF, we occupy a somewhat unique role within the US AGM ecosystem. We're an independent, nonprofit grantee tasked with supporting global internet freedom, in large part through investments in technologies that counter digital authoritarianism. We aren't a journalism organization and we don't create content of any kind, but we help those that do in the US AGM family and beyond counter online censorship and surveillance. OTF is a global program which works pretty similarly across different countries. Even in countries with advanced internet controls like Russia and Iran, people still download the circumvention tools we support to access the global internet. Solutions are developed based on the assumption that overcoming censorship is simply a technical impediment, that once addressed will meaningfully restore free online expression. However, this assumption no longer holds in China. The CCP is not simply building an ever greater firewall. It has undertaken a much more ambitious project by erecting multiple layers of self-reinforcing technical and social controls. This is the wholesale substitution of an entirely distinct online ecosystem. What this substitution does is provide China's censors with a huge home field advantage. The amount of control that can be asserted through ubiquitous platforms such as WeChat is far beyond what is possible on the open internet. On these platforms, censorship is faster, more nuanced, more complete. Surveillance is harder to avoid, and party messages are spread more forcefully. For those who want to look beyond information and connections that are unavailable on domestic platforms, it's hard to know how to do so. The Chinese government has engaged in a really novel project of meta-censorship to obscure even the possibility of circumvention from its citizens. They've criminalized anti-censorship tools and thoroughly blocked discussion of how to download them. Domestic search engines don't index censored sites, and app stores remove thousands of apps at the request of the Chinese government, including most internet freedom tools. As if this wasn't enough, it's only then that users must contend with the Great Firewall, which remains the world's most advanced national filtering system. For the average Chinese internet user today, it's becoming increasingly difficult to even imagine what exists beyond China's domestic ecosystem, much less discover how to access it. The end result of this is a dramatic change in user behavior. It remains technically possible to unblock sites online for Chinese users, but making them aware of these sites or finding ways to direct them there is now an even greater challenge, as it's no longer simply technical, but deeply socialized into patterns of online behavior in China. The era in which we could reasonably assume that most Chinese citizens could and would seek out uncensored content is unfortunately over. We're past the build it and they will come era, and there's no longer a one-size-fits-all model for serving China's informational needs. And yet, despite the impediments and the apparent richness of China's domestic platform ecosystem, what the Chinese internet intentionally omits is really in demand when people know how to seek it out. And I know other presenters to follow will have plenty of examples from their own work that will highlight that. Moving forward, the challenge China presents compels us to adopt an updated approach. We must, and indeed have already begun, deconstructing Chinese online spaces more intentionally and developing better engagement strategies that foster more purposeful connections between information seekers and information providers. And that'll take many forms based on who those information seekers and information providers are. But at a high level, I'll walk through a few approaches. So first, we aren't throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Traditional circumvention tools such as VPNs remain an important part of any internet freedom strategy, and OTF supports millions of monthly active users of VPNs in China, which drive lots of traffic to US AGM content. To complement that strategy, though, we need to more purposefully explore targeted promotion to existing Chinese circumvention users, to bring them to new uncensored spaces and help them re-engage with the global internet beyond the potentially narrow purpose for which they got through the firewall in the first place. Over the past 15 years, many global connections have been severed, and we now find ourselves in the neuroplasticity game as we are attempting to reestablish them. Second, we're working to better understand and support the secure messenger ecosystem in China and how to target information and tools to the needs of the users there. Because sources of objective information reporting are so highly censored, Chinese online information gathering behavior has evolved to rely on asking others, whether individually or in large forums, for information about the topics they're seeking out. But there are a few spaces where this can be done freely and safely when a topic is verboten. Thus, in China, secure messenger apps have already morphed from being one-to-one messaging, like we might use Signal or WhatsApp for, to important free and secure spaces for information discovery and exchange. Third, building off successful mirror-site programs we've run for US AGM broadcasters in Russia and elsewhere, in which individual articles or websites are uncensored for users without them having to adopt a circumvention tool directly, we're fine-tuning publisher-side circumvention solutions so that US AGM journalists can share stories with their audiences directly while taking the technical circumvention burden off their audiences. For this technique to succeed, however, will require greater focus on proactive last-mile distribution than most reporters and news providers are used to considering. So all these approaches and others require us to rethink our traditional lanes and really consider creatively how to best connect and serve audiences in China. To operationalize these, we'll need to work closely across all the US AGM partners and beyond. This strategic evolution is necessary, but will also require new techniques. It'll be more expensive on a per user basis and will require us to be extremely creative and diligent in measuring success and iterating quickly. I mean, it took the CCP decades and billions of dollars in investment to engineer a socially and technologically distinct online environment. The elements of any effective response will necessarily take patience, time, and significant resources, but it's unquestionably worthwhile, and at some level, the reason that we're all here today. So thanks very much.
And Nat, thank you very much for kind of explaining the how we do it. We're going to shift here a little bit more about what the content that is generated. And so I want to tee up Chen, who's the acting director of the China division of the Voice of America, US AGM's oldest network, and it reaches 350 million people in 49 languages. Chen, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Kathleen. I'm excited to talk about how VOA combats PRC influence and overcomes censorship. As a journalist born and raised in China, I grew up listening to VOA, like many Chinese. I saw its impact during the 1989 Tiananmen movement as a college student and learned firsthand that the tighter the censorship, the more people seek the truth. Since then, the media landscape has changed dramatically, with China becoming a major player and audiences moving to digital platforms. VOA has undergone a digital transformation in recent years. Despite CCP's increasing censorship, we remain one of the most trusted and influential news sources for the Chinese people. This is driven by two factors: our content and our digital strategy. Content-wise, we attract audiences with four focuses: telling the truth about PRC, explaining US-China relations, countering Chinese disinformation, and exposing PRC's global influence. Telling the truth about PRC is our cornerstone. What you are seeing here is a Chinese woman swimming across the Rio Grande to enter the US. This video is part of our coverage of China's so-called walk-away movement, where many middle-class Chinese leave everything behind, migrating illegally to countries like the US. Our investigation into this movement, which began in 2021, resonated deeply with millions of viewers as they highlighted the political and economic struggles that drove many to leave China. The video of this woman swimming across the Rio Grande went viral on Chinese social media, making her a symbol of the walkaway movement. Explaining US-China relations is a key strength of VOA's content. Chinese thought leaders and decision makers have long relied on VOA to understand US policies, especially as tensions between the two countries escalate. For example, our live special program covering the House TikTok hearing attracted over 1.8 million views on YouTube. Many Chinese viewers also turn to VOA to access diverse opinions and debates on US-China relations. A recent studio debate between Miles Yu, former China advisor for the Trump administration, and Robert Daly, director of the Wilson Center's China program, drew over 650,000 views and generated thousands of comments from our Chinese audience. Exposing PRC's global influence is also one of VOA's greatest strengths. VOA's 49 language services report on PRC influence worldwide, from Africa to Latin America to the Pacific Islands. What you see here are the images of our sweeping reports on the impact of the PRC actions in Africa and Latin America. In Angola, illegal Chinese fishing is so rampant that officials are considering banning trolling. In Nigeria, Chinese construction firms are pushing out local contractors. In Somalia and Ethiopia, businesses are struggling against Chinese imports. And in Nicaragua, PRC trains the police that may be used to suppress dissidents. We also cover PRC malign influence in the US extensively. This is Wu Xiaolei, a Chinese student who attended Boston College. He was sentenced to 9 months in prison for threatening another student who supported democracy in China. We spent 14 months covering this case, highlighting how China's influence suppresses free speech on American campus. Finally, fighting Chinese disinformation is another core theme of our work. Recently, VOA reported that Google's AI assistant, Gemini, was providing responses in Mandarin that echoed Chinese propaganda. Gemini praised the CCP and Chinese leader Xi Jinping while remaining silent on topics on Xinjiang and other human rights issues. Our report showed AI's potential to spread disinformation aligned with Beijing's narratives. The report was widely circulated and prompted reactions from both Congress and Google. Now, moving on to our digital strategy. In recent years, VOA has undergone a digital transformation and become a major player in the digital landscape. Here's a comparison of VOA China Division's YouTube performance against CCTV, China's state-run TV network. In fiscal year 24, despite posting a similar number of videos, CCTV drew less than 30% of the views we did. This shows that VOA's content is far more attractive to the audience. VOA's impact is also clear from frequent attacks by Chinese officials and state media. Here's Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Zhao Lijian giving a lengthy speech against VOA. The Global Times, the CCP's flagship media, has reacted to VOA content at least 34 times in the past year. Looking ahead, we plan to further enhance our impact through 4 strategies. Better leverage the 60 million overseas Chinese as information brokers to share our content inside China. Capitalize on VOA's global affiliate network to expand coverage of PRC's global behaviors and influence. Utilize AI and other technologies to distribute content that is harder for the Chinese government to block. And finally, many of our viral videos have penetrated Chinese social media and spread rapidly. We plan to build on this success by producing more engaging and high-quality video content. Thank you very much for listening.
Shin, thanks very much for some great examples there of Voice of America's coverage. We're now joined by Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's President and CEO, Steve Capus. He's going to tell us a little bit about the impact of his news operation, which is headquarters in Prague and reaches over 40 million people in 27 languages. Hi, Steve.
Hi, Kathleen. Thank you very much for the opportunity. And I'd like to thank the International Broadcast Advisory Board, United States Agency for Global Media, and CEO Amanda Bennett for this opportunity to speak with you. As Kathleen mentioned, I'm in Prague this evening, or this afternoon, or as a case may be, where we are headquartered at Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. I think when most people think of RFE-RL, you tend to think about Russia and our coverage reaching inside Russia with Russian language content. But we are really busy every day reaching 23 different countries across 11 different time zones in Eastern Europe and Asia. We counter the malign influence of Russia and Belarus and Iran and increasingly China. I want you to take a look at this coverage map. This is the area that we have, our coverage area, where we try to target audiences inside all of these 23 different countries all across the area. Russia is, of course, a dominant focus or a dominant force and focal point for us. But if you look to the right, you absolutely see China and its influence being spread all across the area. And we're seeing China, as we come back here to talk about China becoming more aggressive in producing propaganda, disinformation campaigns, and they're targeting audiences not just in Asia, but across the Balkans, all across Eastern Europe, in Central Asia, all the way down into Afghanistan and Iran, which are all areas and markets that we cover on a daily basis. Indeed, China's economic, military, and political influence is growing in every region we work. Revealing China's expanding footprint across the globe is a point of emphasis for our entire news division. I want to give you some specific examples that have to do with the types of coverage that we do on a daily basis. For instance, we've set up a digital forensics unit within our Balkan service to expose and counter a growing number of sophisticated digital disinformation campaigns. Often we spotlight them before they take hold, and we can do our effort to put a bright spotlight on them before they spread. We're seeing any number of different things that are now taking hold. It's well documented that Russia and China and other authoritarian regimes are working together now to undermine democratic institutions on a global scale. In fact, we're seeing these playbooks of sorts being passed around from one country to the next in an effort to exert influence, to shape the political dynamics, and the tentacles spread far and wide. We have a dedicated correspondent who is based here in Prague who collaborates with journalists all across Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty to document and analyze China's growing influence. This correspondent and all of our journalists really are working on joint investigations with the popular series that we call China in Eurasia. And it is a regular briefing and series of reports that we do. It is also a podcast. The correspondent is named Reed Standish, and I've asked him to pull together a quick summary of 3 of our recent investigative reports looking at China's growing malign influence. Take a look.
From Eastern Europe to Central Asia, China's influence is rising, and Radio Free Europe is prioritizing high-impact investigative reporting. In 2023, our journalists received documents and recordings from an anonymous hacker who hacked the Russian Foreign Ministry and leaked files showing that Chinese and Russian officials are sharing tips and best practices for how to censor information online. Files showed Russian officials looking for help cracking encrypted messaging platforms and arranging visits to study China's own vast censorship system. The story was picked up and cited by independent Russian media like Meduza and Novaya Gazeta, and by prominent outlets like Axios, Politico, and The Washington Post. Elsewhere, our Tajik service investigated the devastating environmental impact of Chinese mining operations. Since 2010, China has emerged as Tajikistan's largest investor, and Beijing owns more than half of its foreign debt. According to one Tajik official who spoke anonymously to our team, the taxes levied from Chinese mining are now so important to the state budget that the authorities don't want to jeopardize it by fining Chinese companies or allowing public criticism of them to grow. Our Tajik reporting team worked in tough conditions to speak with affected locals and got rare shots from the field. The investigation struck a nerve inside heavily censored Tajikistan and sparked calls for the government to better enforce Chinese companies. Turning to Eastern Europe, our Romanian service investigated the widespread use of Chinese-made surveillance equipment by the Romanian government at national security sites. The months-long investigation showed that potentially compromised surveillance equipment is used at least 28 military facilities in the country, including at a NATO airbase that is home to a missile defense system. The investigation highlights how Chinese technology is spreading across the region and how local governments are slow to respond to the data and security vulnerabilities that they bring. The report received widespread attention in Romania and sparked discussion within Parliament about reforming the government procurement system.
Real power of reports like this are that these reports go into all of our markets, all of the local broadcast outlets, all of the websites, all of the areas where we distribute news and information all across that coverage area that we saw before. We do that in local languages. And in some cases, these are now closed markets in which there are no other independent sources of factual, truthful information. And so when people say inside Russia, can hear what China is up to or the collaborative efforts between Russia and China, and that information is shared with audiences inside Russia, we can have an outsized impact. And this is important because the most recent estimates that we've seen of the amount of money that China is spending on media and propaganda efforts all across the world, targeting foreign audiences on their own, is up to $7 to $10 billion. I dare say our budgets are a fraction of that, but what we have to do is to be more creative, be as collaborative as possible, and use the resources and the power of the truth to influence our coverage every day. Kathleen?
Steve, thanks for leading that effort. We're going to move on now to hear from Sylvia Rosabal, who's the director of the Office of Cuba Broadcasting. That's the Spanish language network whose primary focus is providing news and information to the people of Cuba. And Sylvia, tell us how you have been spotlighting the influence of the People's Republic of China on the island of Cuba.
Certainly. Thank you, Kathleen, for the introduction. I'm happy to take part in such an important conversation with our sister entities that highlights an issue we at OCB are no strangers to, addressing the malign influence of authoritarian regimes. OCB has a unique and vital role in informing the people of Cuba. Since its inception in 1985, OCB has had one clear focus: to provide the people of Cuba with objective, truthful news and information. Over almost 4 decades, we have stayed true to this mission. You can see in this slide now, go back to the other slide, thank you. Now our role has evolved to confront new challenges, including combating the malign influences and propaganda from the totalitarian regimes like the PRC, whose close collaboration and disinformation campaigns are increasingly targeting Cuba. Next slide. Currently, China is the main supplier of technology for cell phones and internet services in Cuba. Additionally, according to independent reports, the PRC is actively supporting the Cuban regime, controlling the opposition through the transfer of advanced software to filter and block digital content. Next. Recently, we have seen a notable increase in PRC propaganda within Cuba, building on a long-standing relationship of media collaboration between the two countries. The PRC has maintained a strong media presence in Cuba, with correspondents from major outlets such as Xinhua, the People's Daily, and CGTN. Cuban media frequently uses Xinhua as a primary source for both Chinese and international news. Additionally, Cuba plays a key role in spreading PRC propaganda throughout Latin America by broadcasting these narratives via its international state-run media, further amplifying the PRC's influence. Next slide. The collaboration between the state-controlled media and Cuba, China, and Russia has become increasingly seamless, with coordinated campaigns aimed at advancing the positions of Moscow and Beijing among Cuban and regional audiences. Next. And now the PRC has gone even further, partnering with Cuban TV to launch a weekly show in Spanish aimed at the local Cuban audience. This show, Context, promotes the idea of China as a dominant power in contrast to the United States. To counter the growing malign influence of the PRC in Cuba, OCB is urgently working on several initiatives. Next. Our network is focused on an increased collaboration with USAGM and its entities to translate and share exclusive stories on China and its allies that is relevant to the Cuban audience across OCB's platforms. As shown in this slide, an article from VOA Chinese service was first translated into English and then translated into Spanish by one of our journalists. Another initiative involves sharing OCB's original content on China's influence in Cuba, which counters Beijing propaganda. We expand our reach by offering this content to USAGM entities for translation into multiple languages, increasing its impact. Next. In December of 2023, we established Martí Verifica, OCB's dedicated fact-checking portal to challenge falsehoods spread by the Cuban government and its propaganda outlets. Initially, a collaboration focused on debunking false narratives about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the platform quickly expanded to address disinformation circulated by the Cuban regime. We now have fully developed Martí Verifica, establishing it as a central tool in the fight against the growing penetration of the PRC in Cuba. Our goal is to strengthen this unit to counter the diverse malign influences attacking the Cuban audience, positioning OCB to face these and future threats effectively and efficiently. Thank you.
To build on sort of this look around the world that we have been doing, we're going to turn now to Jeff Gedman. Jeff is the acting CEO and president of the Middle East Broadcasting Network, which reaches an audience of over 34 million Arabic speakers in the Middle East and also North Africa region. Hi, Jeff. Thanks for joining us from Springfield, Virginia.
Hi, Kathleen. Hi, Ken and colleagues. It's great to be with you. And as I hear the colleagues present, it's daunting, but I'm proud to be part of this group, dauntless. There's a lot to confront. Let me give you my 4.5 minutes, Kathleen, of MBN, Middle East Broadcasting Networks. If you're a Republican in the United States, you tend to talk about great power competition. If you're a Democrat, you tend to talk mostly about strategic competition. But in our part of this puzzle, North Africa, the Middle East, you really do see something that is afoot and increasingly full on. It's conspicuous if the president of Egypt turns up in Beijing 7 times in 3 years. It's conspicuous to see China snapping and snatching up contracts in Iraq, in the oil industry, in an oil infrastructure. It's conspicuous in our region, Kathleen, to see the robust Arabic language media absent in covering issues like the Uyghurs in China. And it's certainly conspicuous and painful to see evolving and increasing cooperation in our region between China and Russia and Iran. If you tack on North Korea, you have what the Economist magazine calls the quartet of chaos. It's it's increasing, and it's strategically very important. For us at MBN, Middle East Broadcasting Networks, I'd make 4 quick comments. Number 1, we do very good investigative journalism. We've just undertaken a major restructuring. We're slimming down. We think that we are becoming more efficient, more impactful, but we're not slimming down in our investigative work. And there's so many threads to pull on. Kathleen, we just had an hour ago here in Springfield talking to our journalists and editors and producers, a former Israeli national security advisor who brought to our attention the increasing cooperation between Iran and China in the drug trade with the purpose to destabilize countries, including relatively stable Jordan. Number 2, we want to continue highlighting human rights issues and human rights issues in China. It's important for Arab publics to have access to this information. We'll do news, but we have some very good documentary work, storytelling, engaging and compelling. We're going to do more. Third or penultimate, Kathleen, I'll say, following the lead of RFERL, and this started under Jamie Fly, continues under Steve Capus. We're very fond of the idea of setting up dedicated news desks in the newsroom, where it admires Steve Capus, the work of Reed Standish, and the China desk in the RFRL Central Newsroom. We're setting up a Russia desk, an Iran desk, and a China desk, both to monitor, to feed our programming top stories, and create a new suite of products, multilingual podcasts and newsletters. And then last but not least, my fourth item, we need to deepen cooperation and collaboration inside the US AGM network, but beyond. And certainly inside, Kathleen, I know in minutes we'll be hearing from Bay of Radio Free Asia. And that's, of course, a first address for us. So thank you.
Jeff, thanks very much. Bay is standing by as our final network head to join us today. She's the president and CEO of Radio Free Asia, which provides accurate and timely news and information to more than 50 million people in Asian countries, countries for whom governments prohibit access to a free press. Bay, thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm so glad that we're holding this public event today, because it really speaks to one of our main areas of focus for RFA. As you know, we were created because of what happened in Tiananmen Square in 1989. The US Congress saw how the CCP covered up the news of the massacre to its own citizens and decided it was necessary to create a news service that would give people inside China and other authoritarian countries in Asia access to the truth through an unbiased, uncensored news service. So our founding mission is to be these surrogate journalists. And we, and this is what I want to talk to you guys about, because we are seeing that it does resonate very well in China. Some examples of our exclusive work are represented on this slide. So even when our reporters are not allowed to be physically on the ground in these places, they are able to find ways to learn about what's happening, which enables us to break news about developments that otherwise would be ignored by state media or blocked by censors. So a good example of this can be seen in a clip from Vice News that follows one of our Uyghur reporters, Shoret Hoshor in DC, showing how he basically stays up all night. He calls hundreds of police stations across Xinjiang, and has built up enough credibility and trust with his sources that people do give him information. So he's basically doing shoe leather journalism from thousands of miles away. So if you could play this video.
Shoret Hoshor covers the persecution of his own people as a reporter at Radio Free Asia. The Chinese government knows him well.
So I'll remind everyone that we have the only Uyghur service in the world. This story about The Economist, in The Economist about our Uyghur service, talks about how we were the first ones to report on the genocide in Xinjiang, and how important our reporting is to global knowledge of what's happening there. A longtime Economist editor later told me that this was the first time he'd ever seen The Economist advocate for more funding for another media organization, but that's beside the point. I'm also showing here pictures of our coverage of the Umbrella Movement in Hong Kong back in 2014, which presaged more recent events in the territory when Beijing clamped down on free expression. And then also the white paper protests that we covered 2 years ago, when RFA teams were the first to rapidly confirm citizen journalist images and video and then share them on non-censored platforms that were then accessed by mainland Chinese using VPN. So the news actually circulated that way because of how quickly this was clamped down on inside China itself. So next slide, please. I wanted to share a series of stories that basically illustrate not just, how there were big exclusive stories that we broke, but also because they illustrate the connection between the traditional ways of getting information from inside China, but then also newer, innovative ways we do it that people are actually trying to learn from now because fewer and fewer news organizations are able to have any presence in these places. So the stories involve the destruction of ancient temples in Tibet, which is one of the most restricted regions in China. It's also a region that happens to be center to China's ambition to become the world's leading producer of hydroelectric power. So these massive dam projects are focused on a stretch of the Yangtze River on the Tibetan plateau. But constructing these massive dams, one of which has twice the capacity of America's largest dam, has meant that mass displacement of people and the flooding of ancient Buddhist monasteries, much of which has not been documented before. So RFA's Tibetan service was sent citizen videos showing dramatic resistance to these projects this past winter. They threatened some of the few remaining holy sites from even the 13th and 14th centuries, just a few remaining because of how many thousands were destroyed during the Cultural Revolution. And these citizens chose to send them to us. I just wanted to point out, and that's because of our credibility, because of the trust that we have inside the region. So in this clip, you'll see monks and worshipers prostrating themselves before Chinese authorities as they visit a monastery, and they're basically crying and pleading with them to spare their spiritual home. The footage includes a dramatic arrest of a monk, which was then followed by large-scale protests and the arrests of more than 1,000 Tibetans. It also led to demonstrations in London and other cities in solidarity with the monastery's destruction and arrest. So I'll just pause to show you this short clip. We shared this footage with other networks, including the Wall Street Journal, which actually featured our footage and images, not just in an extensive feature story, but also in a 7-minute explainer video on the impact of hydropower construction inside the PRC. So next slide, please. So, and we followed up that story by doing more stories using satellite imagery, which is an important tool for exile journalism. We used it to confirm an exclusive story about the destruction of another Buddhist monastery. You can see from this slide that after the construction of a dam, the monastery was submerged by the rising waters that began in early August, and then by the end of the month, completely engulfed the monastery. So our coverage of this story basically utilized networks of trusted sources inside China, and as well as these more modern techniques. And it demonstrates how our Chinese language services overcome huge obstacles and are able to do exclusive reporting that resonates with our audiences. Next slide, please. Another aspect of our work is our 2-year-old fact check lab. We created it as a solution, another solution to the vast increase of disinformation that's coming from the CCP. And the idea came during the 2020 COVID pandemic, when we saw how Chinese officials were taking to Twitter to seed these conspiracies to cast blame on the US and misrepresent the origin of the disease, as well as cover up fatalities inside China. So our fact check lab is led by a team of journalists that are very knowledgeable about the underlying media narratives in mainland China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and the US. And it not only pushes back on falsehoods, but also maps the PRC narrative spread on different platforms. I'm very glad that you'll be hearing from Audrey Tang after this, because a great example of this work was in the lead up to the Taiwan elections earlier this year. And so this slide actually shows Taiwan's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Joseph Wu, at a press conference using RFA's fact check investigation that unearthed how pro-Chinese sources were spreading a fake poll in an effort by the PRC to mislead Taiwan voters. Next slide, please. Oh, actually, I'm skipping over this because I see we're running out of time. So next slide about challenges and solutions, if that's okay. Next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. So for all RFA and for all of us at USAGM, the challenges of reaching China audiences are real and formidable. So as Nat in OTF said and laid out very well, the logic used to be simple. It was to find a way to get people over the firewall, but it's really not that easy. Getting through the firewall is not enough. People in China need to actually want to get our content in a way that's useful to them. So we do partner with OTF in constantly updating and looking at new technologies to reach audiences in China. We won't talk about them because this is an open session, but I'm happy to address them privately. But one of the ways that we try to draw audiences out of the firewall is by creating the content that makes them want to reach it. I've talked before about how important it is to get into the closed bubbles of social media platforms in China like WeChat and Weibo, and we are working with partners to promote our reporting behind the firewall on those platforms. But to get people out, I'll look at the next slide. It is, sorry, not this one, the next one. Yes, that's right. Yes, it's important for us to build awareness with Chinese speakers around the world of our content. And that's why our global Mandarin brand, Why Not, Why Now, is so important. Basically, this is highly engaging multimedia content that's aimed at young Chinese worldwide. And it's important not just for reaching these audiences directly, many of whom would otherwise get their news solely from Chinese social media. And this is even, Chinese students here in the US and around the world. But it's also because they are the ones who then bring that content back to their friends and relatives and inside the mainland. So we recently held a series of screenings and events in Taiwan for a project that Why Not, Why Now did on Chinese crossing the U.S. southern border. But unlike VOA's work, this was a feature documentary that followed individuals, and it was the phenomenon of how these Chinese, face economic limitations in China and resorted to desperate measures, risking their own lives and those of their children. But it attracted a lot of attention in Taiwan and among audiences around the world. And we're holding these events partly just to promote these so that it will, because we know that it's of great interest to mainland Chinese. In my last slide, I just wanted to show how, we actually have a way of trying to gauge audiences inside China, which is very difficult. It's a completely closed media environment. But a research group worked with RFA Research on this project inside the firewall, and it provided some really tantalizing insights. They basically use random intercept methods to reach online users, thousands of online users. And it really, if you want to look at this, it really showed that RFA is reaching audiences in a way that's comparable to very well-established brands inside China, and that Why Not is really almost as high in its recognition and use. So basically, I just wanted to conclude by mentioning that sort of one measure of the uniqueness of the role we hold for the Chinese public in the work that we do is just how much social media engagement with our Cantonese service has actually increased in the months since we closed our Hong Kong bureau earlier this year. we moved our reporters out of the territory, and they are now doing reporting on Hong Kong in the same way that we report on mainland China, basically exile reporting. But our monthly video views on YouTube in the 3 months after our closure of the bureau increased by 40% over that same period in 2023. So this is tens of millions of views. So with that, I will conclude, and I'm open to any questions. Thank you.
Thank you for standing by for questions, and to all of our network heads, thank you very much for taking questions. We've invited the public as part of this forum to submit questions, and also my fellow IBAB members might have some questions as well. So first of all, if I could just ask Voice of America, Chen, and others if they want to chime in. We are here in the U.S. Just 20 days away from a presidential election. We've also had some major natural disasters because of hurricanes. And I was wondering if you could address to what extent you spend time debunking the PRC's global disinformation campaign with things that have to do with the United States and what's happening here, such as these natural disasters and our relief efforts, or our election process. Chen, why don't you start off?
Thank you. A big part of PRC's disinformation efforts is aimed at influencing American society, institutions, and the democratic discourse. And a big part of our content is actually covering and addressing that, particularly around major events like the US elections. We have done a lot of coverage on, Chinese police station in the United States, their influence on American college campus. But during the election, we really put our efforts on covering how China tried to interfere with this democratic process. We partnered with Taiwan's Doublethink lab to monitor China-linked accounts on social media platforms like X and TikTok. And we have unearthed a lot of Chinese behaviors, that where they try to influence opinions, public debates about US. For example, we found that the Chinese influence tactics are becoming increasingly more sophisticated by, for example, focusing more on local issues or local politicians. We noticed that, for example, some lawmakers who are more critical of China and who are up for re-election are becoming the targets of the Chinese disinformation campaign on the social media. And also, I think the Chinese, these Beijing connected accounts are also becoming more sophisticated in using divisive issues in the US and accentuate the divisiveness in the American society. For example, the Israel-Hamas has been surprisingly a very big topic covered by these Beijing connected social media accounts. And they were talking about, spreading a lot of lies and a lot of conspiracy theory, such as, Jewish people control the U.S. and, the whole support for Israel is because, the U.S. politics is, in the hostage of the Jewish population. So, the best thing we can do is to set the record straight. So we do a lot of fact checking on these kind of things. As a result of our effort, actually, X, for example, recently removed a whole network of accounts because we exposed these accounts and their conspiracy theories and lies. So that's just shows how VOA can really make a difference in terms of impacting the global disinformation or information landscape.
Great, thank you. Do any of the other network heads want to add to that on efforts at your networks? So I'm going to turn it to one of my fellow board members, Jamie Fly, who said he had some questions.
Thanks, Kathleen. And I was going to ask a question related to where Bei wrapped up, and Shen, you also touched on it. It relates to this targeting of diaspora audiences from China, which I think makes a lot of sense. It's something that U.S. international broadcasting has done over the decades in many countries. But I guess my one concern is the other part of that from U.S. international broadcasting, even when we've been forced out of countries, is we've always committed to our audiences that we don't abandon them. We won't stop trying to reach them no matter what the barriers are that are put in place. And so is there a risk as we prioritize diaspora audiences, which are slightly different than the audiences that are left inside? And not all diasporas, especially in these difficult environments, will continue to be able to go back, and they won't have the same priorities necessarily as the in-country audiences. Is there a danger there? And how are VOA, RFA dealing with that, so you can make sure that you're still expanding efforts to reach local audiences? And the final piece of this is what more do you need from IBAB, from the Congress, to make sure that we can continue to grow our audience inside China?
I can take that first. So yeah, Jamie, thank you for the question. So it's not one or the other. We are definitely trying to reach our audiences inside China at the same time that we're reaching the diaspora. And in fact, we see a sort of engagement between the two, and that's why our focus on of why not on reaching the diaspora audiences is with the intention that they will then be circulated back into the mainland, and that is and we are seeing that. We're actually seeing innovative ways that they're sharing content so that it can't be censored, and so I would say that is, it definitely does not mean that we're taking an eye off the ball of reaching the audiences inside. In terms of I think just the support that you guys are lending us. Of course, we could always use more resources, but yeah, I think. I think if you guys are able to continue your unflagging, sort of support and sort of advocacy for our work, that is very important.
Anybody else want to answer that question? Go ahead, Chen.
Yeah. I agree. I think it's not one thing or another. We certainly still focus on the Chinese audience, and that's always our most important mission, to provide truth for the people inside China. But I think China's role has become so global nowadays that it's impossible to just address Chinese domestic issues. I think China has become a much bigger player. It's global. So and also I think there's a huge need in China to understand China's position in the world and China's relationship with the most important countries such as US. So there's a big need there. And to cover US-China relations or to cover global issues does not mean that we're abandoning the Chinese audience. I think it's all interconnected. And also anecdotally, we know that all the content we have, whether it's about China's domestic issues or global issues or the US-China issues, they're all going through the firewall. The wall is there, but it's not airtight. It's a porous wall. And we know anecdotally, our information, our content is actually circulating in the private social media accounts. For example, the Alaska Senator Sullivan, I think a couple of years ago, he was pushing to take away the designation of developing countries for China. And our coverage of his video comment went viral in China. There are numerous social media accounts shared his comment about why China should be a developing country instead of a developed country. Should be a developed country, I'm sorry. And that video shows the interest about, the US debates about China and China's role in the world. So we don't think these are either war things, but we are trying to do all well. And I think the need is there for this kind of information. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. I think we have time for one more question before we go to the sort of the second portion of this open meeting. And Ken Jarin said he had a question.
Thanks, Kathleen, and thanks to all of you for your presentations today and for all the terrific work that you and your agencies do for the American people, for the world. This is really directed at OTF, VOA, and RFA. Can you tell us more about some of the misconceptions and myths about getting journalism behind the PRC's firewall and into the Chinese information ecosystem.
Why don't we let OTF take this?
Sure, happy to kick off. I would say from the OTF perspective, there are a couple of kind of key misconceptions. The first, which I tried to kind of highlight in my remarks, is that the censorship information control problem is simply one of a firewall, which it no longer is. It's a much more complex system of information control that is going to require more creative solutions that folks have mentioned we're already kind of working on. But the other, to kind of go to Jamie's last question a little bit, is that actually it's far more possible, on the other hand, to get information in when you're confronting that challenge kind of smartly. As Chen just said, it's not an airtight firewall. However, I think that our vision of success often is a little different than what it looks like in practice. I think there's a mental model in which we expect to see virality. That's how success is most commonly defined in non-authoritarian online environments. But that's exactly what the information control system is designed to prevent in China. We want to imagine big holes in the information controls apparatus that are like big sudden ruptures, when in fact the most impactful holes will be more Weberian in their kind of constitution. It'll be the result of a slow boring of hard boards, the kind of thing that Bei mentioned with the just tireless shoe leather journalism and the making calls day in, day out that really connects with audiences and builds trust over kind of a long period of time. And so it's that kind of patient resolve and figuring out new ways to connect with audiences and measure that so that we can continue to iterate. I think is totally possible, but requires us to reconfigure some things.
Thank you. I want to thank all of our network heads for your valuable insights, and also for the shared mission that you also expressed, which I think we all believe is so vital to our U.S. interests and our values, and the values of USAGM, which is to inform, engage, and connect people around the world in support of freedom and democracy. Thank you for joining us. You're welcome to stay with us for the second portion of this conversation, where we're going to be joined by two prominent experts with valuable experience on this topic, Audrey Tang and Sarah Cook. Let me introduce Audrey first, who's a pioneering force in digital governance and a Time 100 honoree for 2023, who made history as Taiwan's first digital minister and the world's first non-binary cabinet minister. Audrey currently serves as the Cyber Ambassador at Large of Taiwan. And thanks for joining us to talk about the PRC's tactics and some of the strategies that you are using to combat the narrative that they are trying to put into your country.
Yeah, good local time. I'm Audrey Tang, Taiwan's newly minted Cyber Ambassador at Large. Really, it is a tremendous honor and privilege to fly the flag of Taiwan at the International Broadcasting Advisory Board's conversation on advancing freedom of information. Now, the strategies, methods, and tools we'll share today put us in good stead to overcome this common threat of malign influence and advanced digital solidarity. One quick example. Back in 2022, the U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan. And during her historic trip, we saw how foreign cyber attacks coordinated with information manipulation truly work on an unprecedented scale. Now, of course, every day Taiwan faces millions of cyber attacks, but during the visit, we suffered more than 23 times compared to the previous daily peak. So the sheer volume of denial of service attacks overwhelmed official websites, while at the same time, attackers hacked digital signboards at rail stations and convenience stores, replacing advertisements with hate messages. And so at the same time, the rumor mill started cranking out sensationalist scares. The hackers have taken over the train system and so on. And because official websites were crippled by DDoS attacks, the consequent information vacuum threatened to create public panic. So how do we overcome that? In the face of alarming surge, Taiwan unleashed a comprehensive response. In addition to the fact-checking ecosystem, we also served real-time static websites snapshots to connections, and so that the information flow remained accessible, and we protected our live systems. We also swiftly quarantined harmful products including hardware, software, and services controlled by foreign infiltrators in the government sector and in public spaces. And we amended regulations and laws to ensure that we keep on this trusted, more resilient network. Now, this mission takes on an even greater importance given the increasingly prevalent role of AI in online environments, including deepfakes, echo chambers, micro-targeting, and extremism, polarization, and isolation. They're all magnified by AI and social media. And in Taiwan, we believe the solution lies in co-creation, aimed at shaping the outcome for the collective good. So one example is our presidential and legislative elections. Foreign infiltrators this time pulled out all stops, coming close to poisoning our information climate and interfering in the outcome. But the government and people of all political persuasions stood as one in derailing insidious efforts to sow the seeds of division and discord. So I'm proud to say that in the year of balloting worldwide, we ably demonstrated through Taiwan's fully transparent multi-party vote counting process what can be achieved by doubling down on transparency to free the future together. And the key to this success was pre-bunking, a process in which poisons of the mind are treated before going viral. The point is to foster mutual trust instead of simply correcting facts. Research shows that a good pre-bunk explains tactics used to manipulate and has far-reaching benefits. By learning to recognize all these tactics, the people are empowered to mount robust defenses. For example, 2 years ago, I deepfaked myself as digital minister, showing that it is possible for anyone with a notebook to impersonate a public figure. And so this year, when audio and video deepfakes appear in the run-up to the January elections, they had little impact. The people were more aware of the practice, and very few were fooled into thinking they were real. And indeed, we also debunk straight after a rumor goes viral, over within the hour. And this approach helps us reach people before they even encounter the manipulated content, creating a sort of inoculation. And Kofax, a crowdsourced platform, also played a key role. Both malicious and innocent reports were analyzed and assessed for accuracy and persuasiveness, allowing everyone to see which ones were trending. And with real-time AI clarification provided by the civic tech community GovZero, people were empowered to make informed judgments about the truthfulness of each content. So by supporting innovation in an open and transparent manner with full respect to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and its covenants, we're building bridges and finding solutions at home and abroad. After all, no democracy is an island, not even Taiwan. And so blessings for your kind attention. Let's cooperate closely to ensure freedom, human rights, and peace are advanced for all. I look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you very much. Really interesting presentation. We're going to turn to Sarah Cook now, who is an esteemed independent researcher specializing in human rights, technology, and foreign influence concerning China. As the founder of UnderReported China, the UnderReported China newsletter, and a former research director at Freedom House, her writings have been featured by CNN, the Wall Street Journal, Foreign Policy, The Diplomat. She's testified before the Senate Intelligence Committee and the U.S. Congressional Executive Commission on China. Thank you, Sarah. And if you would, kind of take a look, kind of zoom out for us, if you will, and look at the broader challenges and opportunities in this global information landscape in light of what you're seeing in the PRC's malign influence.
Thank you. And it's really a pleasure to be able to participate in this conversation. So actually, some of what I'll be talking about does draw on a big report that I worked on when I was at Freedom House called Beijing's Global Media Influence. And what we did there was we analyzed the regime's efforts to influence news and information in 30 countries around the world across 6 regions, as well as the degree of local resilience and capacity for local resilience. So I think one question, and we've kind of seen that talked about from a few different angles this afternoon, is what do we mean by Beijing's foreign influence when it comes to the media and information environment? And we really broke it down into 5 buckets. And you really see how comprehensive and multifaceted these efforts are. One is the propaganda dimension. And some of this is overt propaganda where it's very clear to audiences that they're consuming information from Chinese state media. But then you have more covert ones in terms of people maybe not being aware that where this content is actually coming from. Then you have the disinformation. We've heard a little bit about that in terms of the dissemination of deliberately disseminating falsehoods, including through tactics using fake accounts and other types of dishonest and deceptive tactics. Then you get to the censorship and intimidation. And I think that is something that's often actually happening offline, though some of it's online in terms of cyberbullying or cyber attacks, but can really suppress news and information that's available externally. The fourth bucket we looked at is the controls that we're seeing being able to be exercised by China-based companies that have close ties to the Chinese Communist Party, but are controlling the content distribution infrastructure outside the country. And that would be apps, but that would also be digital television, news aggregators. So it's not only necessarily social media platforms. And lastly, the attempts to export the Chinese Communist Party's model of information control. So looking across that really robust set of tactics, the study found that, not surprisingly, the regime is accelerating a multi-billion-dollar global campaign to shape public opinion. And in fact, in the period that this was looking at from 2019 to 2021, in 18 out of the 30 countries, there was very clear evidence that there was an intensive effort to influence the information environment. One of the things that was striking, especially when we think about the news content and what's circulating, was really the diversity of the languages in which this content was being produced. It's not only in major languages like Russia or Arabic or Spanish, obviously English and Chinese, but in languages like Romanian, like Hebrew, like Swahili, like Sinhala. So there's really an incredible investment on the part of the regime in producing content. And some of it's more ham-fisted and not so engaging, but sometimes they really have social media, especially China Radio International, social media influencers that are very charming and fluent in the local language. Sometimes they're ethnic Chinese, sometimes they're not. And they can actually be very compelling in terms of, really engaging audiences. I think that's just one example in terms of how we see these influence campaigns really being global. So we did a scoring exercise in terms of this. And, not surprisingly, countries like Taiwan, the United States were at the very top, but not that far below were countries like Nigeria, the Philippines, Argentina, Kenya, and even ones that were at the lower end of the spectrum. You could still really see in so many of the countries around the world, some of these key elements of tactics that are clearly some form of malign influence. I think the other thing we see is an increasing sophistication, especially in terms of the use of more covert, in some cases coercive tactics, both across traditional media and how you get content into traditional media, as well as on the social media side. I think one thing I thought I would use my last couple of minutes for is a few thoughts on, what we might want to watch for next. Where we see this going both in the last couple of years and maybe going forward. So I think, one, not surprisingly, there's continued investment on the part of Beijing, experimentation, innovation by various actors within the party state. It's really not monolithic. You've got multiple different party agencies that are involved here. And I would say, I think there's really 5 things to watch for. One is this element related to disinformation and kind of various covert tactics online. The deep fakes that Audrey mentioned. But in some cases, it's not just that. It's like actual accounts that there is someone really behind, but are personas that are publishing and are becoming more effective. So it's not just the massive bot networks. There's a real investment in actual accounts on foreign social media platforms, sometimes on multiple platforms using that same persona, which makes it even more seem like this is an actual real person. But you also have this element, like I said, of social media influencers. You also have sometimes things like reports of like fake bomb threats and things like that that are happening outside of China. So that's one. 2, again, kind of how the offline influences the information environment is the very effective co-optation of local elites by the PRC, especially both in the political and in the media. And so these individuals, who often will have some kind of business interest tied to China, then end up aiding Beijing's propaganda and censorship within the country. So actually in 17 countries, it was a local media owner or a provincial government leader or another government leader that served to suppress or to alter content within that country by that country's journalists. It wasn't just Chinese Communist Party or Chinese diplomats, officials. I I think the other thing that's really important is this element of companies with close CCP ties gaining control over content infrastructure that really can lay the foundation either for current or future manipulation. TikTok has obviously gotten a lot of attention when it comes to apps that fit into this category, but it's certainly not alone. WeChat is a critical one when it comes to Chinese speakers around the world, but you also have a video sharing platform like Kwai, which is in Brazil, Opera News in Africa, Yalla in the Middle East, and a host of other ones where in some cases there are signs of manipulation that or reports of censorship that have already emerged. In other cases, I think they just haven't really been investigated. And then I think the last 2 points relate to this element of kind of expansion. I mean, when we look back 10 years, and I've been following 10, 15 years, and I've been following this space for a while, a lot of the tactics that we see, happening now more globally were really isolated to, either to Chinese language media, because that's been kind of like the main incubator for a lot of these tactics, or we're targeting international news outlets. You weren't really seeing them affecting local media as much in other parts of the world, in the global South, in parts of Eastern Europe and Africa and Latin America. That's absolutely changed. And both the Freedom House study and I think some of the reporting that we heard about earlier demonstrate that. So I think there's just that geographic expansion of tactics. And I think that's one of the things that's really important to be cognizant of and to watch for. I think the other is this element of a topic continuity and expansion. So I think you see the Chinese government doubling down on what has been called the 5 poisons. So these topics like Chinese democracy and freedom and Tiananmen Square, Uyghurs, Tibetans, Falun Gong practitioners, the Taiwan issue. Those are still key targets in terms of both suppression and propaganda and disinformation. I think we have a 6th poison now, which is actually Hong Kong. And I think that's really become a priority issue and has been very clear. But I think the other thing that we're seeing is that there's definitely not a shying away from trying to meddle with the domestic politics of other democracies, not only Taiwan, but also the United States, Canada, Australia. And when you get to other parts of the world in terms of meddling in coverage related to how Chinese investment and other projects might be affecting the local environment, labor rules, and things like that. So I'll stop there. I hope that's helped. I think the one last thing I would say is on the resilience side, it was very clear how much pushback there is still happening in terms of local journalists. And I think we'll get to that in this next section. But I think that was one of the things that we found too, that it's really not just a one-way street.
Great, thank you, Sarah. And you mentioned sort of meddling in sort of domestic issues. I'm wondering if Ambassador Tang could address how you dealt with some of the efforts by the PRC to meddle in your recent Taiwan elections. What was your response to that? What did you find useful?
Yeah, indeed. Recently, we've seen the Freedom House report, which says Taiwan ranks first in Asia, 7th globally in terms of internet freedom. We became even more free than the previous year. And that sounds a little bit paradoxical, but we found that keeping the internet open and making a multi-stakeholder collaboration with all the journalists, all the fact-checking ecosystem and so on, to ensure the rapid response appears within 1 hour of the information manipulation campaigns actually works much better than censorship or taking anything down. The idea is that it's not the checked facts that inoculates people. It is the process of participating in the collaborative fact-finding that protects people. But in order to do that, we need to make sure that this inoculation, this immediate debunking works within this 60 minutes window. So that has really worked in the January election. And arguably, I think the PRC influence, especially around the presidential ticket, backfired so that our current president, William Lai, got elected more than 40%, whereas in the previous polls before the quiet period, it was below 40%. So a lot of the information manipulation, once people see the attribution, actually has a backfiring effect.
Interesting. I know my colleague Luis Tello on the IBAB had a question related to the Global South and what the PRC is doing in terms of spreading a narrative in the Global South.
Yes, thank you, Kathleen. This is a question, maybe Sarah can help us with this. What methods are being used to successfully address the PRC's malign influence in places like Latin America and Africa?
So I think what's really interesting is that you really do see local researchers and local journalists increasingly taking note of this. And it's not because this is part of great power competition necessarily, but because they see the potential for encroachment or sharing of problematic information in their own media environments. And I think one of the things that we found in a good number of countries was that a really well done investigative report about CCP influence, about especially, honestly, otherwise opaque financial ties between local officials and Chinese entities that may not be deemed appropriate by a lot of people in that country. Can actually have a very big impact. And I think, as Audrey mentioned, kind of backfire in terms of China's reputation. And so one thing we saw in a number of countries was journalists using Freedom of Information Act requests to get information in Nigeria about Chinese loans. There was a case in Israel related to money that was given to the public broadcaster. There was an investigation in Malaysia where a local news outlet actually did an investigation on disinformation related to the Hong Kong protests. There was an investigation in Peru regarding Chinese made vaccines during COVID that was given first dibs to Peruvian officials. And so I think you really do see a certain contingent of reporters and journalists and researchers in these countries taking more of an interest. So I think some of the increasing awareness that we've seen happening in more developed democracies is something that's happening in other countries. That being said, people really do have often limited resources. There can be a lot of risks. There can be, as I said, a lot of pressure within the media ecosystem or even by local officials. So in Mozambique, there was an example of a local television station that went and did an investigation about abuses at a Chinese mine, aired it on television, but then got a call from a provincial official telling them they can't air it again. So I think that's where you start to see that political influence. And I think, look, in terms of some of what we heard, and I was able to tune in a little bit earlier, it was really interesting for me, and I was aware of some of the investigations, but not nearly as many as I think were mentioned about the different services in terms of the kind of work that is being done by the services on this issue, including in media environments outside of China that are very restrictive. A lot of the countries that we were looking at were ones where you could have investigative journalism, where someone could go and investigate this. But for example, I think it was an example from the Tajikistan, for instance. That's a news environment where it's very difficult for a local journalist to do that. So it does seem like there could be a really important role for the US-funded services in that regard.
Great. I think we have time for one more question, and I think this is one for two of you from Ken Jarin.
Yeah, this is both for Ambassador Tang and for Sarah. Bring you back to the issue of the PRC censorship and propaganda inside China. We've heard about the challenges, but what solutions do you see working to address this censorship and propaganda within China?
Why don't you start, Ambassador Tang?
Certainly. I was actually interviewed by the VOA about this very topic. So there's this 1 hour footage. But in essence, the same tactics that we used to protect our website against the denial of service attacks, the snapshotting, the use of Web3 interplanetary file system, participatory network to keep the content afloat and so on, the exact same technology underpinnings can also help to overcome the censorship and tampering within the PRC firewall. And in addition to that, I think and I totally agree with the earlier point the OTF makes, to make sure that there's this willingness, there's curiosity of asking what else is out there. We also need to work to engage people in the forms that they are used to. For example, the interactive chatbots, the short-form videos and things like that. But nowadays, I think generative AI can easily generate this kind of forms of content. And so maybe to also adjust the content instead of just long-form investigative reporting, to make sure that there are like translators, adapters to generate this kind of shorter content, but always, of course, with the full citations and links back to the original material.
Great. Well, thank you to Ambassador Audrey Tang and Sarah Cook and all of our entity heads who joined us for this broadcast today. We hope we will see this audience that is joining us today and those who join later by live stream at future open meetings that our International Broadcasting Advisory Board will be holding. They are accessible on our website, our new website, which is ibab.gov. And thank you for joining us. Thank you to my fellow IBAB members, and we hope to see you again soon.